I want to take a moment just to bring up somebody that has a live experience with racism. And it becomes important because, you know, these are real experiences. It's not just what happens to an individual or the individual's life or lives, but it's also describing the impact that it has on them physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually. I want to ask Paula Taylor if she would come up here and share a brief story, because I think it's very relevant, particularly with the situation that we've just encountered down in the Binghamton school system. Would you please come? This is one of our local community leaders and people in this neighborhood, and just welcome her to come.
Of course, this is not my normal thing that I like to do, but anyway, Reverend Bell gets me stuck on this. Well, I go back to a time I was in first grade, and I could read well, and the teacher used to make me come up in front of the class and read. And at that time, of course, you're kind of afraid, don't really want to read in front of a bunch of people and stuff. So I go up there and I'm reading, I'm standing there reading, and I'm reading low. And the teacher comes up and she pulls my dress up. And I wasn't trying to be funny, but the next day she does the same thing. She pulls my dress up. So I decide, I go home and I tell my mother, Mom, the teacher's pulling my dress up. You know, my mother, now you know that teacher ain't pulling your dress up. Yes, she is, you know. So after I come home for several weeks saying that, my father finally tells my mother, maybe you better go to the school and see what's going on, you know. By that time, I decided I better wear my shorts underneath my dress, so when she pulls my dress up, the little boys won't be laughing at me. So I go there, and I'm standing there, and I'm beginning to read, and I look out the door, and I see my mother with the principal. So I start reading real low, and the teacher pulled my dress up. Oh, my God. My mother busts through the door. I mean, she had the teacher by her throat. She's choking her. The principal trying to get her off the teacher, you know. And it was experienced from that point on. I was probably a little devil in school, because after that, she couldn't tell me nothing. Every time the teacher did something to me, I'd be getting back at her, you know. But I couldn't believe it, and I still, today, of course, I find it kind of comical, you know, that they did that. But, and then I'm looking at the news, and I see, well, they're stripping down little kids and young people in school. And I'm like, oh, wow, this can't be real. I mean, come on, this is early time. You know?
This is 2019.
But I said, oh, God, if that was me stripping down in school, my mother probably would have killed the teacher. But, you know.
Yeah, really.
But from then, from that time on, I was a problem in school. They couldn't do nothing with me, you know. And it all happened because nobody believes you. You know, the teacher wouldn't be doing no stuff like that. Well, it happened. And from then on, I was a little wild girl in school. You couldn't do nothing with me, you know. And nobody really would believe that that would happen. I wouldn't believe that that would happen today in a school, that you could strip down kids. You know, we're doing it. And we have to go back and ask the question, what is wrong with us today?
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to make a little adjustment so I can see the screen. Dr. Clark, Kenneth Clark, that spent some years as the first African American to serve as chaplain at Cornell's crew, and he was supposed to be here tonight to do the first part of this. I was going to come and do the portion on Elmira, racism in Elmira. When I found out, I just said, that's fine. I'll pitch it, and he'll come probably the 22nd or the 19th, the next meeting. So things do happen. Now, in filling in, I really wanted to get a sense, and probably one of the voices that's a relevant current voice that's speaking loudly about racism makes a statement in a book of his titled, "We Were 8 Years in Power." And he says the following: white supremacy is not merely the work of hothead demagogues or a matter of false consciousness, but a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it. He makes this statement, and it becomes a very bold statement about a perception of a reality that has been denied since the foundation of this country. Few of which seem to want to talk about it, but it is very relevant, and it is in the very bloodstream of this country. What my report will give you today is the justification to understand that it was intentional. It was intentional that a particular class of people would be subjected to the harsh realities of capitalism that serve the purposes for few. And unfortunately, it engulfed more. We call that collateral damage. You can't always control the impact of evil in your neighborhood, and before you know it, poor whites, middle class, they all got sucked up in the illusion of what was created during an Enlightenment period that has never fulfilled its obligation to the citizens. So let's start first with the definition of racism. First of all, it's a belief that race is a primary determinant. Whoops. I guess I'll go back. The Laments of Black Pathology in America is a criticism of black family structures by pundits and intellectuals. They ring hollow to a country whose existence was predicated on the torture of black fathers, on the rape of black mothers, on the sale of black children. This is an honest assessment of America's relationship to the black family, revealed as it reveals the country to be not its nurturer, but its destroyer. Of course, this is a glance and a look at what has happened throughout generations. And as much as the Emancipation Proclamation had been written to free a slave, it was very clear and evident from 63 on that it just opened up another door where the promises of America still had not been fulfilled. It had not been fulfilled in the South, where Jim Crow laws allowed for the dehumanization and just simply we were treated as property. And we can go through the court system in the United States and see that they have wrestled with this issue ever since the formation. So the issue of racism has always been here. And it's a reality that no other class in America has been subjected to like black people in America. Now, I know we hear about the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were tortured in the concentration camps. Auschwitz is a terrible memory of what happens when people lose a sense of humanity and they become destructive, and in their inhumanity, they begin to justify their actions. Well, for the length of time that we have been a nation, there's been lots of justification without any accountability. Let's talk now about the definition. Racism is a belief in the superiority of one race over another, which often results in discrimination and prejudice toward people based on their ethnicity. What you see, it is a site-based reality, and what makes America so interesting is that when you take a look at Europe and Asia and many of the other countries, they've been around many years. And so they have been able to develop what has been called class and class distinction amongst the people. What becomes unique about America and American racism is that everybody starts out almost in the same pot. But the mere fact that the race to the top is the race to power, and power was the means of controlling the purse strings. And the question became, from the early days of inception to where we are right now, who benefits from the treasury? Who benefits from the treasury of the United States? And the whole fight has been over those tangible realities that have created de facto segregation in the North and Jim Crowism in the South, and all of the lynchings that gave one race dominance over another. It was very clear in our history. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary says that racism is a belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That argument had been destroyed, that black people were inferior to white people. The first funeral I had an opportunity to do was with an individual in Jamestown that actually was a boxer during World War II. And the Olympics during that particular time in not during World War II, but in 1936, when Jesse Owens broke that record, and the whole issue of the superiority of Hitler and the Germanic people was very prevalent at that time. What was significant about what Jesse Owens did is what this man that I buried did, because he was second in the world in boxing. And as much as I remember, his first name was Jimmy, I don't remember his last name, forgive me for not remembering, but that's been over 30 years ago. And as I thought about that, the whole issue of superiority of one class over another is almost the issue that we deal with education today. It's either you have it or you don't. And those that have education have privilege. And you become part of a privileged class, except if you're black. If you're black, you get back. And that's not something that Reverend Lowry said a long time ago that's very relevant today. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, you hang around. If you're black, if you're white, it's all right. But if you're black, get back. I might have butchered it, but I think you've got the idea. The second part of the doctrine is that this doctrine, or its political program, based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles, which means that the dominant group in power has full authority to do what it wants. In fact, the whole issue is centered around how we understand in America as property and property rights. We call them dispositive rights. That an individual has a right to dispose of property whenever they want to, however they want to. And they have a right of use. You can use it however you want to, which means that at any point in time, an individual that was considered property, given the fact that black people at certain times were considered as property, whether we urinated on them, or put them to the gallows, or beat them, or, was able to make money from them. It doesn't matter. Though that was my property, there were no boundaries, because I had an absolute right to do what I want. Now, we understand that the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was something that was endowed and given by God. But of course, I hate to say this, women, particularly white women that are here, that was for white men, and it wasn't for the rest of us. And so when you start understanding this whole idea of property rights,
people in this country have taken that very seriously, and the courts have all got around that. So the whole issue, in fact, if you remember the movie Amistad, so you could remember the whole issue of the slave under the Amistad situation was the issue of property. How many times have we had to deal with domestic violence in this day that may have had its roots in the illusion of dominance that comes from slavery, but has been transferred over even to women of all classes. And the damage is still done because we have not shaken from and shaken off the roots of our failed past and disassociated ourselves with this behavior. The third part of this is that racial prejudice and discrimination, other words for race, other words, you have a prejudice because, you know, I like chocolate cake. Does that necessarily mean I don't like vanilla cake? I love vanilla cake too. I just have a preference for chocolate cake. But when you're talking about humanity, there's something sacred about all humanity. And because white men seem to have naming rights and bragging rights, it would seem to me today that we need to go back to that and question whether they were right. And in fact, if you look at this whole dynamic, that the founding fathers, they all had slaves, with the exception of one. Benjamin Franklin didn't have slaves, but the rest of them had slaves. But when you look at the fact that at the end of the day, they could not figure out an economic system to hold us together anything different than what they did over in Europe. And because it was one that was based on cheap labor, it was very prominent for them to begin this experiment with the contradiction. And that contradiction simply rests with the fact that a certain class of people had to be selected, chosen, and then disregarded, with the exception of how they bring in money. What it means to the capitalistic spirit that even today, we talk about $15 an hour in New York State, of which the state gets a lot more money in its coffers. I got that. What difference does it make if the cost of living continues to go skyrocket and you can't control that? So $15 an hour doesn't mean very much. In fact, if you go backwards and take a look at where $15 an hour really means compared to 1973, they're being cheap. And we haven't done enough, we haven't gone far enough to make sure that we are really giving them the integrity of what they need to sustain themselves in this day compared to where we were in 1973. So who are you fooling? Who are we fooling when we're not really doing the job that we should be doing with regard to income equality and income inequality? Racism appears to be a word of recent origin. In other words, you don't really hear people talking about racism. I turn on all of the stations, and I don't really hear the national commentators really trying to tackle the whole concept of racism. Because for dominant groups, it means that we have to face a failed system. We have to make confessions and admissions we are not ready to make. And if we ever made them, we begin to appear as though we're weak and apologetic, and it opens the doors to reparations, which we don't want to have conversations about. You know what a reparation is, don't you? That's not exactly when mother gives you a cake because you've been good. That would be a simple response. But when we are talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars, And yet that does not correct or change the fact that many generations of families never got a chance to see the next day because of the lynchings, because of the murders, because of the rapes, because of the self-hatred that from that time on to this particular day seems to exist, particularly in much of the black community. And that's the telling story. Now, having said that, I want to go a little faster because I'm not going to be here that long. To create wealth gave the distinction between two types of people. Two types of people. It was a way of distinguishing between the rich, which had privilege, which had the ability of being happy, which had, a right of life and liberty, but the poor. Let's talk about the poor. I know Jesus said the poor shall be with us always. And perhaps the reason the poor should be with us always because in this life, in this world, we've always wrestled with cultures that had a two-tiered system. It was always the rich and the poor. And if you think that just because you've got a job don't mean that you're not one paycheck away from disaster, maybe 1.5 or 2, but you're too close to say that you're not a part of the poverty crowd. You know, the biggest thing that bothers me today is that many of us don't realize just how poor we are. That poverty is more pervasive than we believe. We've sat up in here over the weeks and we've discovered that Elmira is a poster child for poverty on a number of categories. So much so that we've got government leadership that was just absolutely amazed and ready to do something. We've been called in for extra meetings in order to help to resolve some of the tension, some of the hurt, some of the pain, and this is important. Stuff that has been swept up under the rug because we're poor and not expected to be at the table. Today you're at the table. Today you've earned the right to be at the table because number one, you're here. Number two, you want to do something about it. And that's encouraging. So when we see the two-tier system in America, because early wealth accumulation was nearly impossible if Americans solely depended upon the mixed classes and the races of people to unify efforts to build wealth. Power was conferred upon those who were wealthy. Who becomes our politicians these days? I mean, on a national basis. On a national basis. It is very challenging and very difficult to understand in a two-party system when both of the parties are not necessarily elected or put there by the people. But both parties, whether they're blue or whether they're red, have already been pre-selected by the money group. It's not you and I. Power was conferred upon them. These were expected to lead the nation. Race distinction was the preferred method against the Enlightenment ideas found in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I know what I've said. And that means that the Constitution becomes a form of illusionment and possibly hope. If you're here tonight, we're hopeful that we can move toward a more perfect union. But if you continue to hold the tenets of uncultured capitalism, then you take wealth by any means necessary. And we see the result of that. Tradition and law then becomes your tool, and it becomes the fundamental way of enforcing the practices of power in order to maintain your distinctiveness. Don't think that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal worked out things for the soldiers that came back from the war in the GI Bill, that first GI Bill was not for all Americans. That GI Bill was primarily to for a subset. And because it was for the power group that created and supported the class distinction, you can never leave here and say racism was not the fundamental reason why this was done. Because in order to maintain an economic system, you've got to believe in the tenets of that economic system. And the tenets of that economic system says that I can do what I want to do for the sake of the system. I want to talk a little bit about racism in America. I say, and I couldn't help but to think about Malcolm X, because he was a very critical character in the American legacy. And he oftentimes talked about, that racism was a nightmare. And that became a critical analysis of the criminality that was being done to him, his self-hatred upon himself, that got him into some challenging situations, but how he was able to elevate himself and become better as a human being through his understanding of human rights and civil rights, more so human rights. And so when we take a look at the early colonialism, and we see kind of this prehistory to the United States where slavery was an acceptable practice. The first people that came in, Jamestown and in New York State and New Amsterdam. And when you get a chance to see that there were populations as they had come in, this had already predated the American Revolutionary War. So we had already had a practice of doing this from the days that we landed here coming from Europe. And so these practices had been something that had been ingrained in the DNA of America, even before the American Revolutionary War. So in terms of early colonial understanding, and we began as a nation and 13 states, you see that we had a bad start. Then we get a Revolutionary War, which they continue to perpetuate the issue of slavery, though they say we want to be better. The preamble that talks about injustice for all also talks about citizenship. And it talks about something that's very important today that I think that we forget, that the priority of America should have been to establish justice and domestic tranquility, not to fund the NRA through its proliferation and sale of military equipment. Because it's through the military equipment that we find in every city in America that we've got all kinds of trouble. But here, you get a chance to see that in the American Revolutionary War, the critical analysis of it brings about the birth of a nation, but we are conflicted over what it really truly means to be a free people. You can't say on the one hand, I'm free, and on the other hand, I've got slaves. It is a contradiction, it's hypocritical, it's bigotry at its best. And so from that particular point, every issue that we have goes back to that. It goes back to the can I say it in my plain language, to the cowardice and the mere fact that maybe, just maybe, we did not have a better system to recommend, so we gave something that we thought we could buy time with so that this generation can solve the problems of the inability of our previous generations to solve this question. What happens? So we get to the American U.S. Civil War, and you have the illusion of freedom, and you have the problem of slavery. You have many things that are going on in the country itself, And I don't mean this to be just a history lesson, but if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going.
Amen.
And you don't know what the problems are that we're dealing with, the spirits that are still here and haunting us. James Baldwin said, you cannot judge history from afar. And the point that he was making was that history was not yesterday, history is right now. It is not as far away as you think. And so when we take a look here at the U.S. Civil War and the illusion of freedom, or the unfinished work, African Americans were given an emancipation proclamation. And that meant for all of us, that meant that the status of citizenship now changes. You become, and we become, a nation that allows a slave to have a seat. But to have a seat with no protection of law is like having a BMW in the driveway, but I can't drive it. Okay? And so who are we fooling? Who are we fooling? Even LBJ, in a speech that he gave in 1965 to the a commencement exercise at Howard University, says the problem that we're having is that we have given ex-slaves freedom, but we've not given them the tools of freedom. Tools of freedom, tools of freedom, tools of freedom. And those tools of freedom are substantially important, because you can't, and we can't function properly without those tools. So we get to the Civil War, and that becomes important. They win the Civil War, and this is a high moment. We go into a period of Reconstruction, and for the first time, people in this country of color, black people in particular, South Carolina, North Carolina, and other places, now they become part of the electoral process, and then there's some backlash. Just like the election of Donald Trump. After having 8 years with President Obama, there was backlash. We've never seen so many Ku Klux Klan and so many white robes in high places as we have of late. But we got a backlash, and that was Reconstruction, that took away a lot of things, and it opened up the door to mass hatred that we hadn't seen before. Lynchings after lynchings after lynchings, you can name it. There was in Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, that had been created, that was destroyed, completely destroyed. As time moves forward, you get a chance to see a lot of things that were intentionally and deliberately done against those persons of color, all the way up through the civil rights movement. And if you're old enough, some of us remember some of those days, some of the protests, some of the unjust fighting that was going on in city after city, the burning, the riots. In fact, the language of riot, on the one hand, is from a dominant culture that doesn't necessarily see that riot, nor will it accept that black people have a right for redress or a right to protest. Many people across the country in these various cities were protesting that they are human. Whether the sign was "I am a man" or whatever it might have been, we are, as we say in the church, we're all precious in God's sight. And this was a theme that became very important, so that when you get to a time of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, for example, and Black Sunday, and many of us remember Black Sunday, the whole situation, it becomes important to realize that there was some, we get television, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so America gets a chance to see its contradictions, its bigotry. And the whole world begins to look on America and rethink, what are they doing over here trying to tell us how to live, and they've not perfected it themselves. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. We've had a lot of challenges through that time and even up to the present day, where we've not resolved issues of housing. We've not resolved the issues of redlining, where you could live where you wanted to live, or the tricks that were done to scheme money from black people going into different areas, being sold contracts that charged them excessive amounts of money to live in hellholes, and the obligations were never fulfilled. Now they were taking money from black people, and black people were paying these things off, but somehow they never got a chance to take ownership until they were sued, until we decided that we've had enough. And maybe that's the whole issue of this whole issue of why did a slave have to come all the way from Africa to a place that as Harriet Tubman would say, I am just a pilgrim. I'm just a pilgrim on a journey. In other words, she was disconnected from the reality. Oh yes, I know. I pastored in a church that was established by 8 ex-slaves, being inspired by Frederick Douglass in a speech that he gave here in Elmira. I know that. I know that those people gained prominence nationally. I know that. I know that. I know that. I know that this was the center of activity for black people in this community. It was not only protection, but it was also making sure that we could continue to help push to make this country better. There are plenty of records that we have, and some that we have refused to share with the larger community with regard to the activities that were going on in the Underground Railroad up through this day. Because it was important for us to do a lot of things, maybe underground, so that they could get done. It's, as Paul Frazier says, that when privatization begins to take over, it's oftentimes that those that resist privatization, these are the ones that are assassinated. All you got to do is look at April 4th and see what happened in Memphis, Tennessee with Dr. King, and see what happened to him. There are always times where we challenge the system. And so I just wanted to take some time before I talk about Elmira, because that's why we're here. I want to talk about racism here in Elmira. Is that okay?
Amen.
Are you all right? Any questions about the larger? I didn't want to spend all my time in that area because I think that you all have some history of that. In fact, before I get into that, my copier wasn't working quite right. I had intended to give you Slavery and Freedom in New York State, a brief chronology that had been put together by the Freedom Trail Commission. One of my mentors, the Dr. Anderson out of Rochester, New York, who worked on this Freedom Trail Commission. I spoke with him the other day. I said, I want to use your documents, and it gives a good history of what was going on that was important for this conversation. I'm not going to go over all of that information, but this might be something for you to look at, because whenever people are passing laws, you have to wonder, are they for us or are they against us? Are they for us or are they against us? And at this particular point, most of us have our eyes closed. They write them on the books, and because we are a people that claim to be a people governed by the rule of law, now you know that's ambiguous. These things are important because this is how wealth is accumulated. This is how wealth is accumulated. You know, there were people called pirates that used to rob ships as they went across the seas. And they would look for treasure. People have plundered black communities for generations. As I started out, fathers, mothers, broken up families, children. I'm not just talking about slavery, I'm talking about in the courts right here. I'm talking about every court in this land. And if you just happen to have some wealth, they string you up, stretch you out, and drop you. That's a pattern. Elmira. Let's talk a little bit about Elmira and how this all works out. Like every other institution, like every other state in this union, New York State was largely controlled by those who practiced openly racial practices in every institution available until confronted by the need for redress by the many. Maybe I better say that another way. Until you have enough strength to stand up and stand up against and have effective formulas to slow down that avalanche that's destroying our communities, it will continue. In fact, it will accelerate because the nature of evil is that you cannot destroy it. It will only grow. So you have to have a different type of force to move against it in order to change its nature. Racism in Elmira. We are all trapped in a single thread of mutuality, according to Dr. Martin Luther King. Elmira, the pre-Civil War, the role of the abolitionists, the role of John Jones, sentiments of the USA, the impact upon America. You know, Elmira was a military depot. That means that when you take a look at New York State at a particular time, Elmira became a central hub for training soldiers. And Elmira was the place that controlled the movement of all of those soldiers in the western New York, central New York, and the southern tier region. One of the things that Ithaca, has such pride about is that they sent 26 soldiers to fight in the Civil War. What they never say is that they had to come through Elmira and to be trained here. One of the things that's interesting about those 26 soldiers, some of them went and fought in the 54th, Massachusetts 54th, which isn't talked about here. It's critically important because many of us that saw the movie about the 54th and how they fought, and of course they lost, but the whole story of soldiers in New York State was critical for the development of this country, was critical for the state of New York, was critical for Elmira because it was believed and written legislatively that black people could not serve in the military. Don't give an ex-slave a gun. Or don't give a slave a gun. Of course, that didn't stop the British. And it didn't stop some of the Indians. It's a really interesting history we have. But the mere fact that we were one of 3 stations in New York State, Albany was the second, and so we weren't that far from Albany and New York City. So it becomes important for us to realize that that was not only very important, but it was also a source of income for this place. You also have the mere fact that this was a main train hub. So while the Langdons were making a lot of money in the coal industry, and that was significant because we were people that were like frontier people. Frontier people were people that were like, you know, if you take a look at John Wayne and the whole idea of John Wayne, you might see rough and tough and all of that, very, very proud people. But the mere fact that Elmira had trains, that meant an added amount of income that they could make to sustain the families that were here. And when it came to those of African American descent, there was this was a central hub having safe houses in this location. The military camps were wide. They weren't, you know, just like going to the Holiday Inn. They covered a lot of territory around here. So that was central for Elmira. But the mere fact that there were other businesses going on and there were churches, and certainly Beecher has a big name here in Elmira, rightfully so, because he represents a part of the abolition movement, particularly for white America, that says that we don't buy this. That we don't know what the end shall be, but we're going to try to do something different. And the first thing we've got to do is to help undo what we did not do in the American Revolutionary War, and to establish a constitution that was going to be fair for these slaves. This is significant, and I know Divin had his General Divin had his start here, and it's important as Elmira began. But the two things, the military camp and the trains, were important. Those two things were critically important. Conversations that Stephen Douglas would have here became very critically important. The whole idea of slavery in America was a very strong, and this was a very strong pro-slavery community. It wasn't like it was 50-50. There were voices from the religious community. There were other people that participated in the abolition movement. And we're not even talking about John Jones at this particular point. He's a favorite name. But there were other people here too. Harriet Tubman had spent some time here as she was traveling through from Philadelphia. In fact, Philadelphia was the place that people would come from a lot. Certainly, there were those that were coming up from North Carolina that was coming through Seneca Falls and so forth, and coming this way, and that became important. What were you going to ask?
Harriet Tubman, did she actually come right through Elmira?
She came through Elmira to go to
I
Auburn.
remember learning about her when I was a little girl in school down in South Carolina. And then we moved up here, and I always wondered if she might have came through Elmira, because I heard that there was an underground railroad here in Elmira.
There was an underground railroad here in Elmira. There were a number.
Do you know what it was?
I will tell you.
Okay.
Okay, as much as I can. One of the big voices in the Underground Railroad, or should I say in the abolition movement, was Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison. And though he was advocating the immediate abolition of slavery, there were plenty in New York State that did not want, they wanted a gradual progressive. I laugh about that because if Rolly Coleman was here tonight, he would talk about, one of the things that he would talk about was how the church became important and how people in the town became important, especially where there were plenty people that worked in the homes. And as they were working in the homes, it was critically important at certain points in time that they were encouraged to get out of there as a domestic to get a job in a foundry or someplace else where they could get an old age pension, is what they call it, and have better security than what they would have gotten if they were just at home. Well, certainly that made a whole population very upset when they had to do their own laundry. And that was before Sears and Roebuck really had, everybody had one of those washboards. I kept my grandmother's washboard after she died. God bless her. But I just said, God bless you all for what you did back in those days, because, those things were knuckle busters. I could only imagine when those rollers came in. I could see these families wanting to divorce their husbands if they didn't get a new washer that had one of those rollers on it, It's a good thing. But let's go back to this. Garrison was significant because this tells you about the culture of the people here. If we were able to bring William Lloyd Garrison here, who wrote the Liberator newspaper, he was on the other side of that argument. And there was enough wealth and there was enough people to bring someone here. That means that Elmira was a place that was in transition. Now, it might have been a minority of people, but it was still in transition. And I told my congregation this past Sunday, the amazing thing about a mosquito is that it doesn't care what size you are. A mosquito has one thing in mind, or a gnat has one thing in mind. And if you fall asleep, I want you to know he's going to bother you. He's going to bother you until you can catch him. You know how hard it is to catch a mosquito? Until he gets the blood. So these are people that were sensitive to the plight of Africans that now are part of this union, that have been brought over here not because they chose to be here, but maybe by the will of God. And while they're here, they're becoming citizens, they're becoming useful in our neighborhoods, they're becoming very important, and yes, there were underground railroads. The Underground Railroad was nothing but a place where you can get safe harbor in an area until you go to another place. It was always in motion. So stop looking for a railroad under the ground or in some cave. Understand that when we move from heart to heart and breast to breast with each other and become compassionate with the struggles of one another, we create a railroad and we create connectivity. And so we found ways to move from here into Buffalo and Ontario, from here to Syracuse, up over the water to get to Canada, well, to go to Waterport and then go over, and if it was blocked one way or blocked two ways, they came through Elmira in order, do you understand? So there wasn't one way that we went. And because we had a network, I'm always amazed with women. Women have more networks than you can ever imagine. Before I ever get a thought out, they've already thought it. And it's all over the network. And the Underground Railroad was a network. So yes, John Jones was a conductor. That meant that he played an important role here. Maybe the most central role in this community. But John Jones also had his hands in farming, and he had his hands in the business, and he had his hands in being a sexton, and he had his hands in being productive as one that was transforming how we understood the care of humanity, even those that hated you. Michelle Obama said, you take the high road. And he was taking the high road. So when you look at the role of the Park Church, you look at the role, and we were organized in 1840. We have been involved with many things here in this area. But I go back to the railroads. The railroads were significantly important. But it was the Methodist Episcopal Church that was the first church that was recorded that actually responded to the abolition movement here. And yes, Beecher came in, and the Presbyterian Church, they went through things. The Lake Street Presbyterian Church was significant in their support of the abolition movement. One of the things I just met with, I have a group psychiatrists and psychologists and clergy that we come and talk about cases that are sometimes really challenging for us. And one of the things that one of them presented is that he has to present to his Lutheran Synod, which is a national conference, on how his denomination came and fragmented from this place and came over here. And it was interesting. I said, you know, when you went out to Missouri and Missouri and Mississippi and all those places, I really want to know how many of us were slaves to you. Because I really want to know how, what you did when you came here, and how are we today in race relationships and your religion. Because some things never change.
I just want to make the point that the Methodist Episcopals were leaders in the abolitionist movement. They were not, however, always leaders in equality and human rights. And that even in the church, we refused to ordain people of color, and every worship service was segregated. It was not this nice little hearts and flowers and warm fuzzies.
And that was part of a problem, because in the Wesleyan tradition, Wesley advised against that behavior. Yeah. And of course, we had choices, and people, and what split the church was not only the ME Church of the North and the ME Church of the South, but that was a big reason why AME Zion pulled and formed our own in New York City under the John Street Methodist Church, which was the first Methodist Episcopal church in New York State. And so it became important for many of us to understand that under a time of separate but equal, that we could do it too. And we've done it since 1796 to where we are right now. Of course, at the same time, Richard Allen did his down in Philadelphia, which isn't too far from here, which established the AME Church. And so there are a number of churches that are caught up in the abolition movement, the Union Methodist, the CME that came up in 67, and you have the Free Methodists that came up in the 67 in Peking, New York, which, you know, and all of them had issues. And so that was just fragmentation of a body, like all of us go through fragmentation. But all of this was part of the American dilemma. What happens here in Elmira during Reconstruction time is kind of interesting, because we start getting Irish people in here, and Germans, and all of a sudden, and Roman Catholics, which are Irish, and so, you know, and we start having problems. We start having problems with them. We start having problems with the soldiers. There was always some activity. Race became fundamentally important then, and I often think about when I was growing up in Buffalo. We lived all over the place in Buffalo, but where my mother lives right now, it's like a joint African-American community and Polish communities, and we were sharing cultural values. At 11 years old, I'm riding a bicycle on Broadway Avenue, and I hear the sounds, and I'm riding with my friend, my best friend, and you know, and that's only, I'm riding at about 4 blocks from where I lived, and all of a sudden, I get the words, nigga, 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 coming out of a bar, and I'm riding my bike. I'm not thinking too much about it. And all of a sudden, I hear the sound of feet coming my way. My friend Schoolie started riding his bike fast as he could. I started riding my bike fast as I could. My chain broke. Brand new bike. Chain broke. I looked around, and all these grown men were chasing me. I'm 11 years old. And so I fell to the ground. I've covered up as best as I could, and they beat me. Policeman came, an old Polish man. First thing he said to me, I never forgot it. what are you doing here? I looked at him and said, that should not have been your first question. You should have said, son, how are you? I turned around, grabbed my bicycle, fixed my chain, and left. But I never forgot the hostility and the mere fact that grown men would take on a boy. That is the dilemma of this country. And so I want to say that we have some rich stories that are woven in our history. It's not an end. We need to really understand how to make better from our failures and our failed past. And the only way to do it is by acknowledging that it's part of our DNA, not ignoring it. And so when we take a look at Elmira during the Reconstruction time, we see the clash of race. We see even the challenge of two different competing newspapers. And competition is one thing. But when you've got people that bought into a system that have dehumanized black people because they bought it hook, line, and sinker, and the name is still the name of the one that's here, is here today, the Gannett newspaper. I mean, it survived. But it used derogatory language, a derogatory attitude, and so you begin to think about a culture that we have been born into that hates us and don't even know us. But as long as I can make $1 for you, I can get closer to you, maybe. And so it's really a very interesting place, not unlike any other place. But we've had some good people that came out of here, and some good things that have happened. I want to talk, and I'm going to be I want to read something to you, and then introduce something that's going on currently. This is a piece that came out of a book written by George and William Hendricks, titled "Why Not Every Man?" And maybe the key character in here, some of you know. Starts out with blacks were forced into a segregated society. Schools, hospitals, barbershops, restaurants, trains, train stations, theaters, water fountains, and public restrooms, they were all segregated. Local laws enforced these regulations, and in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of separate but equal. In practice, this doctrine became separate and unequal. The height of this doctrine ended with the Brown versus Board of Education, with Emmett Till, the Emmett Till case. How many of you remember when the Emmett Till tragedy? Okay. Separate was inherently unequal. That was what we understood. Schooling for black children was forbidden in the South. And free states, black children were often denied admission to white schools. It even happened to John Jones. Okay. And someone had to advocate for him in order for him to get an education. They were oftentimes sent to poorly equipped and maintained black schools. Black parents began to use methods of civil disobedience to protest this segregation. After Frederick Douglass moved to Rochester, New York in 1847, he enrolled his 9-year-old daughter, Rosetta, in Miss Tracy's Seward Seminary. He was out of town when Rosetta actually began classes. When he returned home, he asked her about the school. As Douglass wrote, I, along
I get along pretty well, she responded. And with tears in her eyes, she continued. But her father, Frederick Douglass, she said, but Father, Miss Tracy does not allow me to get into the room with the other scholars because I am colored. Douglass became angry. He visited the school the next day to confront Miss Tracy. She reported that she had discussed Rosetta's admission with the trustees of the school, and they had raised objections. Miss Tracy thought of being disobedient, but then she remembered how much they had done for her sustaining the institution. Her compromise was to keep Rosetta in a separate, presumably equal room for a term or more, and thereby overcome the prejudice against her. Douglass announced that he and his wife would remove Rosetta from the school. Douglass was by this time a national figure and the editor of the North Star newspaper, which he published in Rochester. He let Miss Tracy know that the entire country would learn of her unworthy conduct. Through his lecturing, his contact with abolitionist newspaper editors, and his own North Star, he certainly could do so. Although Miss Tracy obviously sought to follow the wishes of the trustees, she decided to question her students about allowing Rosetta to sit in the class. She probably assumed that if the trustees were prejudiced, the students certainly would be too. And when Miss Tracy polled the students, one girl said she didn't care if Rosetta stayed. Miss Tracy exposed her own prejudice. Did you mean to vote so? Are you accustomed to black persons? Miss Tracy was not receiving the answers she wanted to hear. She then asked the children where Rosetta would sit if she were allowed in the room. And one little kid said, "By me, by me, by me," was the response, followed by her unprejudiced students. Miss Tracy sent a note home to the parents that day asking for comments on this racial matter. One parent, the editor of the Rochester Courier, objected to having Rosetta in the school. Upon receiving this single negative response, Miss Tracy expelled the child, sending Rosetta home with her books and her pencils. Douglass quickly found another school for his daughter. He did have his say about the prejudiced editor. We differ in color. It was true, and not much in that respect. But who is to decide which color is most pleasing to God or more honorable among men? But I do not wish to waste words or arguments on one whom I take to be as destitute or of honorable feelings, as he has shown himself full of pride and prejudice, says Douglass. After the mistreatment of Rosetta, Douglass worked actively to desegregate the public school in Rochester. The pro-slavery Irish faction, Douglass said, won the day, and a new segregated school was ordered. To save money, the school board decided not to put up new buildings. Instead, it contracted with the Black Zion Methodist Church there in Rochester to hold school in the basement of the church. Douglass led the campaign to change school policy. Rochester schools were finally desegregated in 1857. I say that to say that many of our churches began what we call freedom schools in the late 40s, 1840s, as a response in this country, because if it wasn't going to happen, if they were not going to give us anything, we had to do it ourselves. And so we organized freedom schools, and the freedom school idea was no more than making sure that these kids could read, write, and arithmetic. The 3 R's, they used to say, and maybe if they're fortunate, get a skill. But of course, many of these schools going up through civil rights period, they were poor schools. They had secondary books. But I want you to know that they produced some brilliant people that became brilliant contributors in this country. When I take a look at the contributions that have been made there have been many. And when I look at even the mere fact that not too far from here, Solomon Northrop, who was a key figure in 12 Years a Slave, maybe some of you saw that movie or read the book. The Fugitive Slave Law Act that was signed by Millard Fillmore in Buffalo, New York, who was lifted up to the presidency from Buffalo, New York, that brought in a whole new class of people that became refugees as they were running from being deported back. And it didn't matter if they were free slaves or if they had been escaped slaves. The Jerry Rescue in Syracuse, all of that was important. Even the mere fact that Elmira College created the first female school in the area, that was also a critical move because, you know, from the American Revolutionary War up through, there had been a lot of efforts to educate women in this country, primarily white women, but it was still an effort that went beyond white men. I had to put that in there and let you know that. I want to talk for a minute and then I'm done. 20th century, the role of the church. And it's not just this church, there were some other churches available, formed by ex-slaves, I told you about that, to provide uplift and purpose for people excluded from the American dream, was an abolitionist church that who later pursued national policies to remedy this nation's mistreatment of colored people. We had pastors that confronted Theodore Roosevelt while he was governor, and certainly when he became president. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was progressive, but nonetheless, there was a lot of exclusion. Even with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his union movement, there was still a lot of leaving out of the African American in the community. And what impacted the larger body impacted New York State, impacted Elmira, so there was a trickle-down effect of it all, and so we wanted to make sure that we were connected. Many of our churches had spread all over the country, so we had connections to help move and to mobilize people in different communities. Numerous pastors and church members continued the spirit of social justice and upward mobility of its membership in the community as it advocated for participation in American democracy. Currently, she continues her work for the benefit of all Americans to see a more perfect union in its day. From run-ins with local police departments, my current bishop's father pastored this church from 44 to 46. And it was noted oftentimes there were many run-in with police in this area, particularly aggravating the Benjamin Street community. And that was a community that you had a lot of blacks. In many communities, small communities, there was always what we call a pocket called Little Africa. And this was no different, though it was called something different, whether it's Slab Town or Frog Town or whatever, it's some kind of slang name. And this was where black people lived, primarily because they didn't want you over there across the train track. They didn't want you in West Elmira. So we wound up having community where we were. He was very instrumental in dealing with the police, and oftentimes many of our pastors have been dealing with police issues and trouble issues and issues with poverty, lots of poverty, employment issues. I don't think that there's too much that we haven't had to deal with. And as the church developed in 1954 because of urban development, urban renewal, our church was the largest church in this community. And it was significant because, you know, you talk about breaking up black power in this community. And that was the key thing that did it. Because with the church we had, it was substantial. And when that got broken up, it made it possible for the other black churches that we have here now to take root. And so on the one hand, you see a breaking up of power. On the other hand, we see a diversification. And so it is really important to realize that in many communities, urban renewal was used as a weapon and not necessarily a gift. And we saw what happened to Jones Court in this community and how it had blighted this community. So that doesn't mean that it wasn't a good effort, a good intent. What it does mean is that, you have power and forces that we're not even familiar or aware with that are working. And some of them are working against you because it's about the dollar. And so right now, we're trying to bring a medical school in, and there's a lot of construction going on in the city with regard to, taking a look at some really expensive housing that goes along with it. Now, there are no jobs, there's no industry that's going to put it, but maybe the students will be able to afford them. All right, I'm not 100% sure that's going to be a workable model, but somebody's getting paid with tax credits, and somebody's getting paid in other ways, and so these are things that we've got to stay to keep ourselves in tune with. I just want to leave you with examples of overt racism right now. A few years ago, there was a minister at the Lake Street Presbyterian Church by the name of Minister Shazar that had an issue with the police department. And that has continued to leave a bad taste in my mouth. I've had conversations with the chief of police then. I've had conversations with the chief of police now. And the way the police department was embarrassed at the courts over that whole situation was really interesting to see. But they charged him $400 for the mere fact they put him in jail. And they left him in there for 4 hours, he and his cousin, over an issue where he was called to a particular location that just happened, and consequently just happened to be a location where a police investigation was going on of a drug bust. But he went there because his children had been robbed by somebody, and he went there to find out about his children, and he went in a civil manner, trying to identify him as just a minister. And I want to know where my children are. The chief of police verified that that's exactly what he said, and so we had no dispute. What we do have a dispute with was how he was thrown to the ground. How he was thrown in a police car, and why 10 police officers had to shake down one man with drugs. And not a single one of those police officers did the first priority for him, and that was to protect him. It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with a hostile situation, that they treated him in a hostile way. And what is ironic, the irony behind it is that the police department is only 30 feet from the church that he works in. And we've got public servants that don't know the community that we serve. And all he kept saying, I am a minister, and with the implication, you should know who I am. So it is up to us to make sure that this community is doing better than it has done before. I was glad when the old chief retired shortly thereafter. And I just want you to know that we can do more together than we can do alone. The 4 black girls at the middle school in Binghamton that were strip searched by the school officials, 12-year-old girls that were allegedly strip searched after they analyzed that they were giddy, so giddy that it must be because they're doing drugs or have something to do with it. And we find out that there are 2 laws on the books that allow for searches. But whether or not they've gone overboard is another question. And the allegation is that they went overboard. How would you feel if that was your children? How would you feel if that was you? It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter who you are. When you cross the line, you've crossed the line. Where's the community? Not just a handful of people that's protesting, but where's the community? Because if it happened to them, it can happen to you. And then you have the situation with the school district. They got under 1% of black people working at the school district. Hardly anybody as a teacher. And it doesn't even mirror the population, doesn't mirror any school district. It doesn't mirror America. It doesn't mirror New York State about minorities. And so there is disproportionate employment there. And when the question comes up, what about the education of the black children, particularly the black boys that are dropping out before, when they get to the age or get to the point of getting to the 10th grade, and they totally disappear, and the graduation rates and the college readiness rates are atrocious. If you were to give your money to somebody as an investment advisor and they gave you a 1 or 2% return, you can do better by yourself. You can do better by yourself. So why is this community allowing the school district to hand up to to mass incarceration these children? Why are we doing that? We can do better.
Amen.
We can do better. Because they're our children. They're not just their children. They're our children. The amazing thing about it is you never know which one is going to discover the next medicine that's going to help us get through. Or to do something that makes this community better. You don't know that. I can tell you that plenty of people have been overlooked that have tremendous potential. And these children do have tremendous potential. And then we just live in a place where with the 2 prisons that's connected to mass incarceration and continue the whole concept of Jim Crowism. And so the jail population and the prison population that's profiting off of poverty and keeping themselves alive at the expense of the poor is wrong. And what we're doing is closing our eyes to a situation that must change. And we cannot go into the 21st century with our hands behind our backs, fiscally, financially, or morally, with this situation. And so we have that problem. And then lastly, there are many symbols, or I call them visible sins against our neighbor that continues throughout the land of the free and the brave. That there are plenty things that we just don't see. Plenty things that are being done in our Justice Department, in this community, that would cause you to shake your head at. And I'm not saying that we don't have some good people with badges, good people working, in the Justice Department. We do. But I think that what we have are some fundamental problems that have been set in place, from the beginning of the American Revolution, actually before that we have not done well with. And until we deal well with that, we will never get to the point of being a more perfect union. And until we get to that particular point, we will not take care of the women's issue. We will not be able to take care of any of the other issues, because fundamentally this issue is the most central of all. You take care of this issue, you fix the rest. I want to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, let's talk.